Hello everyone, this is Asif Bin Ali, a Faculty of Media and Journalism program at North-South University. I'm welcoming you all to listen to this podcast, a fresh start from North-South Media and Journalism Department, powered by North-South University's Radio, TV and Digital Lab. Today is the second International Day for Countering Hate Speech, and we have our esteemed guest, Dr. Susan Vize, to talk on this particular topic. She is the officer in charge of UNESCO office, Dhaka. So Dr. Susan was working in Dhaka since 2022, and prior working in Dhaka, she was working as UNESCO Regional Advisor for Social and Human Science in Asia and the Pacific, and she was based in Bangkok. So she has a PhD in Community Natural Resource Management from the University of Melbourne. So we welcome Dr. Susan Vize to our show.
Hello everybody, pleasure to be here today with North-South University. Great to be here, Asif. And thank you for thinking of this podcast, because I'm really pleased that we can have some discussion on hate speech and how this is a pressing issue, not just in the world, but in Bangladesh specifically, because we have a bit of a pandemic of misinformation and disinformation going on here. And hate speech is a big part of that.
How are you doing, and how is your journey going on in Bangladesh since you started working here since 2022?
I'm really pleased to have been here. It's 11 months now. I still feel quite new. So in some ways, there's a lot to learn about Bangladesh. It's a tiny country in one way and a huge country in another way. So I think every day is a new journey and discovering new things. It's been a warm welcome from everybody. I've managed to see a little bit of the country, a little bit outside Dhaka, because it's very easy to get very Dhaka-centric in going out to places like I've been to Bagarhat, to Cox's Bazar, to Khulna, and last week to Rajshahi for the first time.
That's my hometown.
So seeing a little bit about what people's lives are like, that it's not just this city-centric thing. Going to museums, going to cultural events is also a fantastic way to get to know a little bit about the history of the country. I also have found out a lot about the Liberation War, about the heroes of the nation, and all of these things. Actually, today I went to Sheikh Mujib's house, and I saw the museum there for the first time, and that was also very interesting. So it's a fantastic journey.
I'm happy to know that you are traveling around and having an on-ground experience. So, Sue, as you know that today we are discussing a particular day, an International Day for Countering Hate Speech. And my first question to you, what do you think? Why countering hate speech should matter to us?
I think that this is something that affects, it's always been around. Hate speech is not something new. It's something that has existed since the beginning of time, because there's always somebody who is jealous of somebody else. And the fact that we now have social media is what has really escalated it. And the reason why we actually have the United Nations Action Plan for Countering Hate Speech is specifically because of the explosion of hate speech that has been enabled by this online presence that we all have. The other part about the online presence is that it exposes so many people to it who are somewhat protected when they were not in this open area. And so being online, even little children are often online, like YouTube, even Facebook and things. There are ways to get around the regulations. We're seeing it a lot with young people in particular, and this is a very vulnerable time of their life. We're seeing it in the US elections is a classic, where there's all of these things going on all the time. We're seeing it in every aspect of life because the social media has become integrated. And I think what's been happening with Twitter recently and taking away the barriers is, I guess, emblematic of the direction that some things are going. And what we want to do by raising awareness of having this day is to make sure that people are thinking before they send information out there. They're thinking about the ethics and the values in the information that they put out and the impact that it can have on other people.
So, it's not new that the hate speech was there. And because of the social media, as you were saying as well, that we are facing more and more hate speech than we used to face, I mean, before the era of social media. Because the number of our interactions was limited and we are not exposed to too many peoples. So from that point of view, what do you think how UNESCO is working to counter hate speech?
So UNESCO's program is centered around freedom of expression. And you might say immediately, well, isn't hate speech just part of freedom of expression? It's just people saying what they want to say because, you know, they want to say good things or they want to say bad things. But freedom of expression comes with a price. And when we promote freedom of expression, we want people to have positive conversations and do good things for the world. So the basis of the work on freedom of expression is fundamental about getting access to information. And access to information is something that we all need to make our lives better. School is a classic example. We're getting information. The newspapers give us information. If there's a cyclone, if there's something, it's the information that we can get that helps us to deal with it. If we want to be a professional or an engineer, we need information. So to be aware of the world, to know about the COVID pandemic is a great example. Access to information was critical so that people could protect themselves. So I think that's the first principle. The second principle that we should have is that we always want to do no harm. So when we're actually sharing information and things, we should be aware of trying to promote things that are, yes, factual, also things about how we feel are good or how we want to express ourselves, particularly expressing our culture, expressing our history, our religion, all of those things should be positive. But hate speech is turning that around by attacking people for a characteristic such as race or ethnicity or religion. And that's when it becomes bad because that doesn't help anybody. We can actually build a better society if we promote cohesion, solidarity, and tolerance. Understanding, like we were just talking before this show about understanding about Bangladesh history and culture and how I find that very enriching. So if I was just going to say something bad about Bangladeshi culture, I lose and you lose. So promoting positive expression is better for everybody. And hate speech is very harmful because it not only can cause personal trauma, it can actually have economic damage. So we really don't want things like that because they might only be benefiting one or two people. What we want is things that help the whole of society.
So, especially, I mean, access to information is very important, as you said. During the COVID time, what we have seen that there was flood of misinformation and disinformation and fake news. And if you look at Bangladesh context, what you would be seeing that there is three group of people, particularly producing hate speech, fake information, disinformation. The one group is coming from religious groups. I mean, they have their own agendas. This is not particular one religion. I mean, there are multiple because this clash over ideas. So they, to some extent, produce hate speech. There is another group which is the people who believe in conspiracy theories in many cases, and that group become very activated during the COVID time. So the anti-vaccine campaign or like that kind of things was there. So these particular two groups often produce hate speech in a regular basis. There is another group which is very crucial, which is the political group, and political group comes from all corners, and they also to some extent produce hate speech against each other. Now, in this particular situation, what do you think how UNESCO can work with Bangladesh together jointly to come up with a proper mechanism to counter hate speech?
I do think what UNESCO focuses a lot on is what we call media and information literacy. And the whole premise of media information literacy is just like other types of literacy. If we're given a book and we can't read, we're illiterate, we can't have any value from it. If we're given information, if we don't know how to process that information, we can't get the value from it. So it's exactly the same kind of concept. So media information literacy is about being able to take in what's in the media around us, all different types of media, evaluate it, fact check it, and then make our own decision how we will act on it. And I think what happened during the pandemic was, of course, there was a flood of information. This makes it really difficult for us to be able to process that. So that's one thing about this whole kind of volume of hate speech and misinformation that's out there. It's quite difficult to deal with. But the other thing is about making people critical or have critical thinking about, where did I hear that from? Is that a reliable source? Can I fact check it, or how can I find out if it's true or not? And then the final part always is each individual does have to make up their own mind. So making a good judgment is based on your values, and each person's judgment will be different, and it's perfectly valid to come up to the conclusion, I don't want to have the vaccine. That's fine. If you make that based on good and verifiable information and based on your values, I don't have a problem with that. If you get information from people saying that the vaccine will kill you, the vaccine is, made of something, rats or something like that, people will get scared of it. That's all based, if you believe that, then your judgment is not a good one, and you're potentially harming yourself and those around you. So it is a value decision. Everything is a value decision. So each person's values won't be the same, and therefore each person's decision is different, but it's having those critical thought processes that allow you to evaluate and make the best decision for yourself and your community that's important. So media information literacy is a program that can be embedded in schools, can be embedded with parents, can be promoted through the media to actually give people the skills to be able to make those informed decisions.
So, of course, we need to work in the education sector in order to implement those things. But I want to take this discussion in a more critical angle. So, because we were discussing before we start this recording, so I often face this question to myself even, what is the boundary? Because you see, it's all about a speech, and free speech is one of the most powerful elements that motivated our societies to bring changes. Look at the American history and
Bangladesh history.
Yeah, or our history, my country's history. If you look at when people started expressing their free opinion, they went and they walked towards freedom, had a struggle, and win over their independence. Or the freedom of expression also used in Martin Luther King's movement, and that ended up a kind of racism in American context. Laws started getting changed and giving more space to different racial minorities. So speech is very strongly important things. But then who decide which is hate speech and which is freedom of speech? What is your take on that?
I think the line between the two is always going to be very difficult to manage. And as I said, your line and my line, they won't be in the same place because we have a different culture, a different religion, a different history of you've lived in Denmark, you've lived here, I've lived in Bangkok, I've lived here. So we have all of these different experiences, and that all goes to our value system. So the thing about going back to media information literacy is that I guess there's two key things. One is that is about the individual and where they put their own boundary, and we each have to have our own boundary. The other thing that we work on a lot is the media. And media in most countries tries to regulate itself by having codes of ethics and things like that. And this is where common values come into place. So if you develop something like a media code of ethics about what is acceptable to print in the newspaper or put on the TV, then that group of people is self-regulating where that line is. And that means if you were a journalist and you overstep the line, your media body will come in and sanction you in some way. So It's just like with doctors. They have medical boards or doctors' associations, and they actually, through that kind of community common shared values, decide where the line is. And so I think we have two main mechanisms of figuring out where the boundary is, the personal one and the communal one. And so communal forums that we can have, like a media association or something else like that, can play a really critical role in countering hate speech. Because if we don't have that collective action and it's up to everybody's individual actions and decisions, it would be very difficult to do anything to move forward to address this. The third player, I think, is government, and government does play a role. And governments often set the environment, set the tone and things like that. So it is also important. But if self-regulation is there, government can step back a bit. If self-regulation is not there, then government has to do more.
So you're talking about the role of government, and of course, like government always play a very important role in terms of creating check and balance situation to counter hate speech. So if I talk in the context of Bangladesh, we are not different from any other societies in terms of facing hate speech from organized source and from non-organized source, like from individuals as well as from groups. And we see there was at a certain point, there was discussion of introducing new laws and regulations to counter hate speech. For example, very renowned, quote and unquote, the DSA Act, Digital Security Act, which was there since 2018. And this law, when it was introduced in a manner that it says that the law will protect people from hate speech. But then when we see its ambiguity, its vagueness, and its application, we see it is more repressing people and taking their rights of free speech, then creating a safe environment for people against hate speech. So there is this dilemma of idea and its implementations. What do you think? Like why these things are happening, or does it promote a kind of culture of shut up kind of things?
Well, I'm very glad I didn't have to draft a legislation like that because, as you say, the boundary is super tough. I think legislation is always a difficult thing to deal with because it's a balancing act in itself. And you said we've already been discussing how this line is very vague and it's in different places. I think government can play a really strong role through something like education, and in fact possibly more impactful than something like the DSA. If we were to educate every child to be digitally literate and to be responsible. For example, children are getting their ethics mainly from their parents and religion. What are our common values as a society? Sometimes we can miss that when we get and one of the things that Bangladeshis are always very proud of is the fact that you have a multi-religious, multi-ethnic society. In reality, that's not necessarily what is being taught to children because they get these values through the different groups like religious groups. So government role, I think, can be very, very strong through education campaigns. Right from the smallest children up to university students, and in particular, I think university is one really good age group to target because this is when they're over 18 and they kind of have free access to social media. They don't have the kind of boundaries that younger kids have. So rather than just thinking about legislating and creating this kind of barrier way of doing things, government could actually think about how they can promote this in other ways that help every person in the country. So I think that would be a really good role for government. Digitally literate citizens, responsible citizens, and that would be good for everybody.
Yeah, I agree with you on that point, that of course the fight should be in the field of education We need laws, we need regulations and proper
Yes.
implementations of that. But that is the extreme measure, that is the hard measure. But before that, what are the softer measures that we could have been taking in order to educate more people, in order to empower them with common values to counter hate speech? And I think there is a problem with our understanding as well, isn't it? That we want to deal with every problem by hard power. Uh, you know, picking those people, putting them behind the bus,
Yeah.
or in the medieval era, it could be like
Much worse.
forcing Galileo
Yeah.
to say, okay, world is not round, it's flat,
Yeah.
and then asking him to say sorry to whatever he said. So over time, actually, this authority also changes. So
Yeah, the boundary of what's acceptable changes over time too.
yeah.
You just think about, like we're sitting here today with no barrier between us. In some cultures and societies and age groups, we couldn't sit together as a man and a woman.
Yeah.
So, all of our values aren't static, which is the other thing. And this can also be a problem with laws too, because sometimes laws don't keep up with the changing values. But it's something that, again, it's always going to come back, regardless of whether there's a law or literacy. It comes back to how good our decision-making power is. So the kinds of things that the government can do is, well, education is one thing, but promoting social tolerance, cultural tolerance, religious tolerance, and all of those things. And this is what we do through the Ministry of Culture. So the Ministry of Culture, they're kind of everybody, you might think of culture as about protecting the past and protecting the way things used to be, but I think it's actually protecting, it's more than that. It's about helping citizens in a country to understand their identity, and your identity is very strongly linked to your value. So what we do with cultural programs, I think, is really important to this ability of building cohesion in a society and having us understand each other. So when I go to a heritage site, I'm not only seeing a beautiful building or the Sundarbans or something like that. I'm actually seeing the community that lives there. I'm seeing their way of life, and I'm learning to understand how they're different from me and to appreciate that. So the kind of measures that we can do to build social cohesion and social tolerance would be things like sports programs, culture programs, all of these things that bring people together. And cultural life in Dhaka is quite vibrant. We have things like Lit Fest, which is quite big. I was really surprised that there was
a big festival.
there's this huge interest in reading and literature in the country.
Yeah.
Then we have like Shilpakala Academy that is actually encouraging dance and music and all of these kind of things. We have other foundations like the Crafts Council and things like that that are doing this, trying to bring these kind of things into the community. I don't know much about sports in Bangladesh, apart from that you play cricket. In Australia, we play cricket. But I guess there's probably lots of things happening in this field as well. And it's a great way to build community and build positive understanding and break down people don't want to do hate speech against somebody when they know that person and they understand that person. So social cohesion is really important.
Yeah, you are absolutely right from that point that we need social cohesions. But also, like, if we look at the South Asian context, so you'd be seeing like for example, cricket. If there is a cricket match between India and Pakistan, it's also a cricket match between who could produce the most amount of hate speech against each other. Or if there is a cricket match between Bangladesh and India or Bangladesh and Pakistan, we see the similar kind of things. So it's I sometimes think it's not only the cricket. Actually, you need to go back to the point that you are mentioning, education, that we are still not focusing on the education. Rather, of course, cricket gives a platform to build communities, but then that communities, when they are injected with a certain kind of nationalism and identity politics,
yes,
we end
I
up
can
doing the
see
same
that.
things. And most of the time, the organized hate speech comes from organized communities.
Okay.
How to deal with that part?
It's a very good point. I must go to a cricket match here because I've been in Australia and I think it's quite a positive vibe. And what happens there is you do get little cliques in the stands. So depending on who the countries are, you have, like the Australian group that is cheering for the Australians, or you have the Indian group that is cheering for India or whatever. And they might yell at each other, but it's not in a hateful way. So I'm sure it happens. So yes, it's a really good point that you make. And you're right about a lot of things being organised by groups as well. And again, coming back to media information literacy, if a group's message isn't being effective somehow because people know that it's fake, then the group loses its power and the impact of its hate speech. So I do think it comes back to our individual ability to be able to be critical and analyze what's coming out of these groups. And so it's individual, but there's also a lot of groups, and I don't know, because I don't understand Bangla, so I can't see necessarily what's happening here. But in the US, if you're a YouTube fan, there's kind of the Trump channels and the anti-Trump channels. And they are kind of putting out their different measures, countering each other. At least in this case, you've got somewhat of a balanced dialogue because the media is actually presenting both of the arguments. And hopefully they would be mostly presented in a respectful way, but I guess not always. But we need to be able to have some balance in this discussion. So again, free speech is encouraged, but if you stand up and say the Australian cricket team is the worst in the world and they should all go home and they shouldn't come, I should have the right to stand up and say, but didn't they do something good for they helped with the Fred Hollows Foundation that helped a lot of children get their sight back. So, but I shouldn't come back and say to you something terrible about the Bangladeshi team to counter what you said. If I do it back in a respectful way, using information, using a good argument that shows how they were good as opposed to bad, then maybe you're going to start changing your mind because it's about hearts and minds. If you're sticking to your value and the Australian cricket team is the worst in the world, I'll never change your mind. But maybe at least I'll make you think about it. And this is why dialogue is important, and we have to actually have spaces where different views can be aired and we can have a discussion about it.
You are right about this point that we need a space, safer space and dialogue. So with that point, I just want to bring this topic in the table that particularly in the South Asian context, since you were working in Bangladesh and you have been, and to some extent you got involved with the UN working in the Asian region, because I was looking at your bio. So I am presuming that you understand to some extent the landscape there. So there is a re-emergence of a new form of hatred in like South Asian countries, be it India, Bangladesh, Pakistan, or Nepal, for instance. Of course, the issues are different, but if you look at the phenomenons, and if you put like one or two words, you will get similarities there, which is hate speech and countering minorities, countering decent voices. And also the alarming is attacking journalists by using hate speech. And since I'm a faculty of media and journalism, so one of my interest areas is also looking at how journalists are getting attacked by both from the state and from the readers.
Yes.
And from the owners as well of those media industries. So if you look at the data, like World Press Freedom Index, we will see like Bangladesh is now in the position of 163. And in last 5 years, it has stepped down 17 points. I mean, that's not a very hopeful news. And if you look at it in the South Asian context, it's India, Bangladesh, Pakistan, Afghanistan are in the risk zone.
Yeah.
Journalists' life are at risk. And often the argument that has been used by the communities or the groups or the state are attacking journalists is the difference between the freedom of speech and the hate speech. And the ideas of censorship have been implemented there. So how UNESCO could play a role there with the local governments to create a kind of awareness and help these journalists out?
So we also have a UN plan of action on the safety of journalists, and UNESCO is the lead agency for that too. We've been having consultations with journalism groups in the country for the last year to try to identify what are some of the key issues that they would like to address and how they would like to address it. And I believe later this year we'll probably have, we've had a consultation in Dhaka. We'll probably have some consultation outside Dhaka, because the information that's been coming to us is showing that there's actually a lot of issues in all the regional cities as well. It's not just very Dhaka centric, because the media is big outside there as well. So the difficulty here again is how do you address it? You can have as much discussion as you want about what the issues are, and obviously you know what the issues are. But what is working in some other countries is building a coalition of people who want to make it safer for journalists, and actually using their voice to come together to promote actions. So this is where we still have to design something for Bangladesh and get ideas from people like yourselves, from media houses and others. Maybe we need to work at the industry level, because like you said, sometimes the industry itself is quite hard on journalists, I believe. Working conditions are very hard.
Job security.
Pay is very low.
Yeah.
Job security is not good. So, looking at the industry and what can the industry do to help itself to be more professional and better about these things. I mentioned before codes of ethics. So if you were to go to media industry in other countries, you would find that most of the groups will have some kind of code of ethics. These are the kind of things where they set the standards that are relevant for the culture and the context of the country. Now, I'm aware here that there is so much media. This is always going to be difficult, because I don't know if per capita, but you have so many newspapers, so many TV stations. The ability to actually bring everybody together, this is actually, it is another issue for Bangladesh. So how do we create these kind of platforms? I guess we start with the coalition of the willing. We work with those that are positive about trying to make this kind of change, build social cohesion. And if people join it, that's well and good. Not everybody will, but hopefully over time it starts to make a difference. Everything that we do has to be people opting in to do it, not through force, and self-regulation in particular. So women journalists are a particular target, and I'd like to raise that one in particular. They get harassed from all sides.
Yes.
And a lot of that is definitely in the hate speech category, because a lot of it is quite hateful about them personally, like how they look or how they behave, because maybe they're doing something that's non-traditional, so they're somewhat exposing themselves to do that, to do their job. And the industry doesn't seem to provide a lot of protection for them. So it can be quite unsafe.
Yeah, you are absolutely right on that point. And especially one thing I often notice, that when there is a debate about media freedom and journalist safety in the context of Bangladesh, we only blame the state. We never consider the industrial setup in which journalists work, the corporate management that they dominate the editorial policies and the business interest of those particular house, those who force journalists to decide which report to go for and which report not to go for. And particularly the female journalists, of course, there is an additional issue which related with the gender. I want to draw your attention with something more contemporary. more practical, if you can call it, that hopefully in the coming year we are going to have an election, national elections, and we have already seen those who are researching in and looking into the elections and the political development, this regrouping and a strong emergence of organized hate speech from all corners. Like sometimes it's the government who is the victim, sometimes it's the oppositions who is the victim, sometimes it's the candidate who would be participating in the election. They are the victim. Sometimes the voter is the victim. Sometimes people who are involved with the election, they would be the victim of those hate speech and also would be threatened physically. And those hate speech would be leading to a kind of physical threat and mental threat as well. So this is a very complex situation. There is no black and white. It's a very nuanced situation. In such situation, what do you think, how UNESCO could, get in to help, especially by using the education and other tools that during the election time, there could be some arrangement to reduce hate speech?
I think because UNESCO works largely through long-term types of projects, I don't think there's anything that we can do that's related to the election. For example, education, we're looking at like a 20-year journey of every child in Bangladesh from birth to say when they're 20 years old, and then they hopefully will end up being a responsible citizen. So it's not an immediate thing. And again, it is quite interesting when you look at some of these, everything's not doom and gloom. You mentioned the World Press Freedom Index, but there's another index about religious tolerance or violence, and Bangladesh has actually improved dramatically on this one.
Of course.
So I think that it's really good to have data. And one of the things that UNESCO tries to do, so for example, with safety of journalists, we do have a, what do we call it? We have like a website where all of the different deaths of journalists are reported. And then also the action that has been, all of these are also, it triggers a letter to the state. So this is the Bangladesh government. And then the state has to respond and say, investigate. The state's investigation. I'm not saying the state's responsible for the deaths, but the state is the one who has to do the investigation. So this website records all of that, and you'll be aware that there's been quite a lot of journalists killed in Bangladesh over time, and a number of them are unresolved. So we can't always have an answer to everything, but at least it means that there's a way to follow up and try to check on what's happening. So on the one hand, we want to educate people and make them responsible or encourage them to be responsible because we can't force them to do anything. On the other hand, we try to monitor data and actually look at these kind of trends and see how we can bring this to the attention of the government or to the industry, because I agree, it's not just the government's role to deal with this. It's the role of civil society. It's the role of the media. It's even the role of platform providers like Facebook and Twitter. And of course, you'll be aware that they've had their various own controversies in relation to all of these things over the last couple of years.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with this point as well, that though there are different stakeholders, but in that stakeholders, I think the most powerful stakeholder is the government. And if you work from a constructive perspective, then it has to be the government should be with you, and your role should be working with the government, not against the government, because only that kind of collaboration, despite all the obstacles, could be able to ensure a kind of safety network when it comes to freedom of journalists in our context. Now, we are at the very end of our discussion, actually. So I was thinking to ask this question at the beginning of the session, but later I thought that, okay, let's have the intellectual discussion first, and then we'll go and dive into some of the personal experience. So you lived and worked in different continents. So you're from Australia, you worked in the Europe, you worked in Bangkok, in Dhaka, and traveled most probably half of the world. So have you, in a personal level, experienced hate speech? And how was that experience?
Actually, I have to confess that I don't use social media. So I'm somewhat, I don't receive a lot of negative things. But of course, everybody at some stage in their life has probably been the recipient of something that you could say is hate speech. I actually feel that I come from a very privileged background, and I probably haven't been as exposed to it as most people, possibly not as much as you, but I have seen the effects of people, particularly younger people. I've seen the effects on other people when they receive some kind of message on their Facebook that says something not nice. And it's a very real effect. So I don't have a good story to tell you about myself. I'm sorry.
Or maybe some of your colleague who faced it and then opened up to you how it has impacted them.
I have had colleagues that have had some things said to them that have hurt them a great deal, and that's why I say I can see the trauma when people go through this. I think that my role has mainly been trying to encourage them about how they're going to deal with the trauma. And I guess that's something that we didn't talk about. Like when you're the victim of hate speech, that's another aspect that we could have another whole 20 minutes. How do you personally be able to deal with that? And again, I think that this is where you have to understand your own identity and your own values, and because you can be your confidence in your own person can be shaken by this. But we the only values we can go by are our own values in our own life. So somehow we have to be able to have the courage to stand up to that kind of thing. It doesn't necessarily mean retaliating. It might mean going in another direction, not responding can actually be the best thing that you can do, because this is actually part of the other problem, I think, with hate speech, is it becomes a backwards and forwards and like a battle or an argument. And what you really don't want to do if you want to put a damper on it is to have that happen. You want to get away from it.
So are you suggesting something like Buddha did, that, don't allow the external elements to affect your internal mind? So it's you who decide which to touch you and which not to touch you. That's a
Absolutely. And that's what this kind of media information literacy is about, or citizenship skills and all of this. It's actually about giving people self-awareness, identity, strong conviction in their values, understanding what their values are, but also understanding how they relate to other people and how other people differ from them.
Yeah, I mean, you were absolutely right on that point, Sue, that like most of the energy that we spend to discuss about who to blame about the hate speech, instead of empowering people to think critically so that they can, at the personal level, deal with that.
Yeah.
Because a lot of hate speech victim is individuals. And most of the time, those individuals may not have voices to come up. We only look at the big individuals, and if they face the hate speech and how to counter them by law and other things. But what about the individuals which lives in the periphery, which face those hate speech every day? And I think from that point of view, celebrating a day to counter hate speech, of course, is an addition to the movement in that. And do you have any, last podcast, last moment wish to celebrate this day, and for those who are working to celebrate this day?
Well, I think for all of you out there that might have experienced hate speech, I guess the basic thing is that you're not alone, but also it's not the end of the world. And if you think about it and come up with a good way to be strong in your own position, and that you are, you're right and you're happy with yourself. That's the best thing that you can do, and celebrate this day by being positive and actually not letting it beat you down, and making sure that your voice is out there and your voice is a positive voice.
Thank you, Dr. Sue, for joining us today and sharing your thoughts on this discussion. And it was really amazing to hear from you and to know how media literacy and critical thinking can actually help us to solve the problem of hate speech, which is also a big threat for us in the individual level as well as in the institutional level. So thank you very much for joining us today, and we look forward to hosting you in some other programs here. So thanks and take care.
It's been great to be here today, and thanks to North South Media and Journalism Department for hosting the podcast, having the idea to have this. And I'll just end on say no to hate speech. Join the online campaign, #SayNoToHateSpeech. You'll find it on the UN Bangladesh website. And hopefully see you all again next year.